So now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's first speaker, Jennifer McLeod-Macy, Vice President with Ipsos's Public Opinion Research Team. Jennifer, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ellen. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you, everyone, for coming. We have a lot to cover. We may go over our 45 minutes, but please stay with us, and I promise you that you won't be disappointed. The story that Siam and I are about to tell is a collection of various sources from our knowledge base, particularly a global study which we conduct annually, surveying more than 20,000 adults around 28 countries on our Global Advisor Service. We also have our Context Advantage knowledge base, Context Now, our socioeconomic indicators in citizen sentiment study, and our COVID sentiment deep dive tracker, and Context Next, our future prediction study. Also, today's webinar is supported by established facts, statistics, and research from academia and multilateral organizations. We've all been inundated with the bad news headlines of the pandemic over the last year. Pandemic job losses threaten to leave women behind permanently. COVID-19 and its economic toll on women, the story behind the numbers. Women at risk of long-term work disruption. Women's participation in labor force reaches the lowest level in 3 decades due to COVID. 10 times more women than men have fallen out of the labor force since February, either through job loss or by leaving jobs to care for family, young and or old family, during the pandemic. According to Statistics Canada, 12 times as many mothers as fathers left their jobs to care for toddlers or school-aged children over this past year. Moreover, StatsCan reports that mothers face higher job losses than women without children. 500,000 Canadian women who lost their jobs during the pandemic still haven't returned to work. I don't need to read everything on the slide. You can see these startling numbers here. Women earning less than $800 a week have experienced the most job loss. As Siam will discuss in a few minutes, women are being hardest hit by the pandemic because they tend to work in the industries most affected by closures, earning losses and layoffs. They're also more likely to work in essential services where they're more likely to be exposed to the virus. Gen Z women are 2.5% of the labor force, but account for 17% of job losses. In January, the unemployment rate for women aged 20 to 24 was more than 6 percentage points higher than its peak in the 2008-2009 recession. What I present on this slide is what we call the Ipsos Disruption Barometer, or the IDB. It is a proven metric which represents socioeconomic sentiment and predicts sociopolitical disruption. It's something that we've been tracking for years. When the barometer is high, citizens and consumers are more open, tolerant, and inclusive. When the barometer is low, citizens are more insular, intolerant, and exclusive. They're more likely to participate in disruptive behavior. Our clients use this index to help understand the state of the market, the state of society, and to guide their messaging, pricing, and shape their CSR initiatives. Today, I present not the Canadian or the American IDB, but rather Canadian women versus men. You can see the purple line, women remain flat and decidedly negative, below that gray bar in the middle, while men in teal have improved and are now marginally negative or borderline positive. This pessimism persists. There is a higher sense of threat for Canadian women than for men. We created another index, an urgency index, whereby we combined 8 items around personal and family threat, community or country threat, and global threat. Half of Canadians feel threatened, but the real story is in men and women, which we present here on this slide. A majority of women feel a sense of threat, while just 43% of men do. And this sense of threat is higher among women at all levels. And what I mean by that is their sense of threat for their local community, their country, and their world. In all cases, they feel so much more threatened than men do. Moreover, 3/4 of women feel the Canadian economy will continue to worsen over this year. the end of 2020, in December, we asked Canadians to what extent the following words described how they feel when they think about their personal future. Canadian women feel fortunate and determined more than anything else. But incidentally, fortunate only spiked at the end of the year, doing maybe a year-end reflection. Before that, it was on par with all the other emotions. That said, Canadian women also feel uncertain, frustrated, nervous, and isolated. I'm now going to turn it over to Siam.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'm Siam, and I will start by talking about gender and work. Bear with me while I navigate the slides. All right, what you see up here in this very colorful chart is that jobs that are mainly seen as being done by women are also those most likely to be seen as being paid too little. Top of the chart, you see 89% of Canadians agree that childcare providers are mostly women, and that's also where 61% feel these professionals are paid too little. And a similar story emerges for nurses, care providers, teachers, shop workers, and assistants. When we take a closer look at what this tells us, this chart really hammers in the inequality very starkly. In the fourth quadrant, bottom right, you see that the roles played mostly by women, which are also paid too little. What's interesting in these occupations is that they also mirror the sectors most impacted by the pandemic. Women, especially the ones who weren't earning much to begin with, are bearing the brunt of job losses, as they made up a majority of the workforce in these hard-hit sectors like hospitality, retail, food. In addition, not only are these sectors the most impacted, they will also be slower to recover. At the same time, healthcare, childcare, education, when it's not virtual, are also the sectors where flexibility, work from home options are limited, physical distancing is challenging, and as Jennifer mentioned a moment ago, puts one at a greater risk of exposure. And when we compare this to the other 27 countries, the position of these 5 professions in Canada shifts further down and right of the chart, implying a much worse position in Canada. At the opposite end of this spectrum are professions that are mainly done by men and are thought of as remunerated generously. Politicians, bankers, doctors, engineers, accountants, etc. Below it are professions mainly done by men and paid too little. Construction workers, delivery drivers, also the sectors which were hard hit in the early days of the pandemic, but were quick to bounce back. Police officers and scientists who are also the heroes of the pandemic. And now our quadrant 2, which is my least favorite, but also the most hard-hitting. When we try to find the professions that are mainly done by women and paid too much, grim silence. There are none. This picture that we saw really points to the term we've all heard all around us, the K-shaped recovery. Any rapid change, acceleration, innovation always has a disproportionate impact on certain sections. And Oxfam calls this one the inequality virus. This pandemic has really widened the gap between the haves and the have-nots. Those who are paid higher also had the luxury of greater flexibility, were not going out shopping or eating out as often, and ended up saving more. And hence you see the real estate boom. People are buying houses, people have saved up more. On the other side of those who were paid lower, perhaps on contractual part-time positions, they did not have the option to work virtually. These are the ones who are on the downward spiral, and which is where, as we just saw, women tend to be concentrated on. Canadians do acknowledge the existence of the gender pay gap divide. If we look at the data, 56% believe that concerns about the gender pay gap are a response to a real problem. More women than men voice this opinion. Few believe that the pay disparity concerns are an example of political correctness going too far, and Canada fares much better than the global average on both of these aspects. We also asked about credibility of reports in the media about gender pay gap, and about half, 47% to be precise, believe these reports represent the truth. 11% do say that it's fake news, but again, trust in media is higher in Canada than almost all the other countries that we surveyed. While the recognition of this issue is high, when asked to assign a priority right now, Canadians are divided. More than 3 in 10 do feel that closing the gender pay gap should be one of the top priorities right now, and that's 4 in 10 among women. However, about half do not feel that addressing the gender pay gap features in their list of most important issues right now. And no shock, everything in the world is being seen from those red tinted COVID lens. We've been tracking the top issues worrying the citizens of various countries for many years now. And throughout the last 1 year, fighting the pandemic has dominated the issue agenda. While managing the pandemic and broader healthcare concerns are priorities, unemployment, jobs, the economic repercussions of the pandemic figure very prominently. And other issues such as climate change, racism, discrimination, immigration, and women's issues have taken a backseat. And this order of priority is not very different among men and women. They share the same top 3 issues, but they show some differences elsewhere. For example, women place a much higher emphasis on COVID. Jennifer earlier spoke about how the sense of threat amongst women is high. They place a higher emphasis on COVID, on healthcare, on housing affordability. And on the other hand, men emphasize government deficits, debt, taxes, and corruption. But what's worth noting here is that this preoccupation with all of these prominent and, in fact, very straining issues of putting food on the table, having a stable job, affording a house, has meant that for both men and women, women's issues feature very feebly on the list of most pressing issues. Given this shifting focus, we ask Canadians to predict the impact of COVID-19 on gender inequality and gender equality, and let's see what Canadians had to say. 2/3 say that COVID-19 has impacted both men and women equally. If we compare the negative impact on men and women, almost 4 times more Canadians acknowledge the negative impact on women. 1/4 of Canadian women expect to be much more negatively impacted than men. And if we contrast this to the other 27 countries, Canada ranks 3rd highest in the negative impact for women. Thinking ahead, 54% Canadians feel that as the country recovers from the pandemic in the coming year, gender equality between men and women will revert to what it was prior to the pandemic. A much higher proportion of women feel their gender would be left less equal. 18% are not sure of the impact. But let's just take a moment to think about these 54% who feel things will remain the same. Is this our best case scenario? Can we call this optimism? About the same time last year, just pre-pandemic, a majority of Canadians did not feel that workplaces in Canada treat men and women equally, or when it comes to giving women equal rights, things have come far enough in the country. So I would say the answer is no. Status quo is just not good enough. So what can we do? What do Canadians desire or feel would ensure that the programs for recovery address issues facing women? If we look at this, the top 2 priorities that emerge are more flexible working practices, which include work from home, part-time working, and better mental health support services. Men and women may be on the same page on the priority order, but women assign a much higher importance to flexible working practices, better mental health support services, support for those facing violence or abuse, or better social and childcare assistance. Now, let's compare this to global rankings. We see quite a few contrasting aspects there, specifically the ones highlighted in red. While for the rest of the world, the second order of business is support for those facing violence or abuse. For Canada, the second place is reserved for better mental health support services. And I'll talk about that in a second. But the second area where we see differences between global average and Canada is that more Canadians prioritize social care services for the elderly or vulnerable. And that speaks to the demographic construct and societal structure of the country. Canada has a higher proportion of elderly, and the concentration of the outbreaks in the long-term care facilities perhaps justify this focus. One aspect that stands out to me is that more women in decision-making positions, be it in businesses or in government, isn't seen as important in Canada or other countries. And that leads us back to that stark blank box we saw where higher paid women did not occupy the higher paid jobs. And more representation in higher ranks is not only a key to parity of pay, but it's also to ensure that this cycle of equality is kept well fed, well oiled, and it continues over time to our future generations, to ensure that half of the world's population is not making decisions for the other half. Coming back to mental health concerns amongst Canadians, 51% of Canadians said that they are grappling with mental health and or addiction issues as a result of the pandemic. And that's been pretty constant throughout the last 1 year. And that's half of the entire country's population, an overwhelming proportion. But this overall figure glosses over very important subgroup nuances. This proportion actually climbs up to 58% among women as compared to 48% among men. It is also higher among those with children in the household. It reaches 62% amongst those. Speaking of those with children, it is not uncommon that an unequal impact of childcare falls on women. The data throughout the last year has consistently highlighted the wide gap between stress and anxiety that the parents have faced. Many parents, particularly women, had to make a choice between a full-time career and their mental health as they juggled between school closures, then reopening, then closed again, then virtual learning, quarantines, shutdowns, their jobs. Reports from Lean and McKinsey have been consistently highlighting the impact on mothers and mothers of color in particular. 1 in 4 women, and that comes to 1 in 3 mothers, are considering reducing their hours or leaving the workforce altogether because of the pandemic. Mothers are 3 times as likely as fathers to be responsible for majority of housework and childcare during COVID-19. Mothers are also twice as likely as fathers to worry that their work performance is being judged negatively because of their caregiving responsibilities during the pandemic. And that's really worrying. That further adds to the stresses and anxieties that women and mothers in particular are facing. And these trends are really striking. And if they continue, the fragile progress made over decades for women in the workforce, for gender empowerment, for equality, could be lost to the pandemic. While there are health implications of the pandemic, I may get the virus, I need to keep my family safe, and there are financial implications of the pandemic through job loss, business closures, uncertainty, less savings. While These financial and health implications may be striking the surface. These trends point out that the implications on society as a whole could be seeping in much deeper than anticipated. The chief of United Nations, while he was talking about this devastating socio-economic impact of COVID-19 on women and girls all over the globe, he pegged that these trends could undo generations worth of progress. Women are feeling more lonely. They were burdened by the stress of work, managing the household, and at the same time, they were under containment and lockdown measures. And that has meant that more women find themselves feeling lonely. But they're also more likely to have taken actions to improve their health and well-being. 50% of Canadian women have actively engaged in activities that help manage and relieve stress as compared to 34% of men. 37% of women have spoken to or taken help from friends, family, or their colleagues. 13% relied on self-help books, articles, mobile app to boost productivity, and another 14% actually consulted medical health professionals too. And on that note of resilience, I will pass the floor to my colleague Jennifer for taking us forward into the recovery from COVID-19.
Thank you, Siam. So how will we recover from COVID? Even with the promise of a vaccine, most Canadians believe that we will still be feeling the economic after effects of the pandemic 10 years down the road. Canadians also think that other issues will fall by the wayside, as governments will remain heavily preoccupied with economic recovery post-pandemic, and hard-won progress on other issues, such as gender equity, will stall. So to summarize, 2020 shone a light on the existing inequalities and widened the fault lines. If we are to make progress in gender equity, going back to normal will not be good enough. And there is broad public support for change. Business and political leaders need to make it happen. So how do we build better than back to normal? We need to address awareness. 2/3 of Canadians feel the pandemic will have the same impact on both men and women. This is a problem. This perception is definitely a problem. There is a dire need to communicate the long-term implications of the current situation. Before the pandemic started, gender pay gap was a problem. Participation from women was a problem. Sectoral inequality was a problem. Lack of representation in leadership was a problem. Not to mention conscious and unconscious biases. These will only worsen if gender equity is not addressed. Not to mention the risks of long-term unemployment, which creates the risks of skill erosion and reinforces the problem of inequity. We need to reiterate the priority. Yes, economic rebuilding is a priority, but it must be understood that we cannot build back for only half the population and by only half the population. It needs to be understood that the process must be inclusive to be sustainable and wholesome. Economic recovery and women's progress are not an either-or. It must be a way of reconstruction. We need to demonstrate a commitment. The matter of gender inequity must stay high on the agenda. As businesses, as managers, we need to use our influence and our capacity to question biases, to commit to transparency, and to commit to gender balance. Finally, we need to favor flexibility. Flexibility is a key aspect that can support recovery. The pandemic has set expectations of the new normal, a hybrid workspace. But this needs to be adopted by everyone so that women don't become invisible again. So before we move on to questions, I'll leave you with this quote from Julia Gillard, former Prime Minister of Australia and chair of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at King's College in London. It's been said that we are at a coronavirus crossroads. We face a choice between building back better or allowing progress on gender equality to stall or even be reversed. As the world decides which path to take, the good news is that the vast majority of people recognize that closing the gender pay gap is important. The bad news is that in many countries, people are less clear it should be a top priority right now as we begin to reopen and rebuild society. But if we're to have any chance of ensuring women don't lose out further because of the crisis, we need to keep this issue high on the agenda. And now we'd like to open it up for some questions.
You can start typing in right away. Okay, I see them flow in. Jen, are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay, let me read the first one. Very topical and something we've definitely been researching a lot on. The pandemic has brought to light other important issues over the last year. Where do women stand on racism?
That's a great question. We actually have a recent study on racism that we conducted last summer. Siam and I actually conducted that one together. It's hard to believe that was almost a year ago now, but it's still quite relevant. In that study, we found that women are more likely than men to recognize systematic racism in Canada. They're also more likely to consider racism against Indigenous populations in our country as serious as racism against Black Americans in the United States.
Thank you, Jennifer. There are lots of questions flowing in, so without further ado, I'm going to throw this one at you. Women are certainly experiencing COVID differently than men, but aren't young women particularly vulnerable?
Yes. Also, a recent poll we did among youth and adults, if I recall quickly, it was 16 to 24-year-olds. We found that women were more likely, women and young women, I guess we would call the teenage girls, young women are more likely to say they're feeling pressured to succeed. They're less likely to think they're doing just as well as their peers. This is really disheartening. It's the sense of pessimism among these younger generations that I worry about. Could have long-lasting implications on their self-esteem, their overall satisfaction with life, and then as they grow up, their work productivity. And this is something that will have long-term effects long after the pandemic is over.
And that speaks to the confidence amongst women. We know, we've seen that in workplaces, women do face a lack of confidence in their own ability to vouch for themselves, to be their own brand ambassadors. And that sort of gets reiterated and seeps in much deeper.
Yeah. I'm afraid we were already struggling with that before the pandemic. It's only made things worse.
Thank you for that great question. The next one speaks to our top issues. And it says, while listing the top issues, you mentioned that the lower priority placed on women's issues today is driven by COVID. Do you think that once COVID passes, the urgency or prioritization will naturally rebound? I could read that again. It was a long one.
Okay, thank you.
While listing the top priorities, you mentioned that the lower priority placed on women's issues today is driven by COVID. Do you think that once COVID passes, the urgency or prioritization will naturally rebound?
Yeah, I think it might, but it's going to do so in a space with other competing issues. We're essentially parking a whole lot of issues, large issues right now while we deal with COVID. But they're all going to come back at once, and we're going to see a lot more competition for funding and for attention. And then what are we going to do? Are we going to be able to tackle gender inequity at the same time as climate change and diversity, privacy, automation, affordability, education, health is always there. How are we going to tackle them all at once? There's going to be a lot of issues from a wide group of constituents, and they're all going to want to be made a priority.
Competition for prioritization. Speaking of financial issues, the next question says, do you have any measures of financial stability? If yes, how do men and women compare?
Yeah, we do. We actually have surprise, another index. We love creating indices to help explain the world. We have what we've aptly named the Financial Health Index. We run this quarterly, and in this index, we've seen that Canadian women are more likely than men to say they are struggling or sinking. This index is comprised of a number of factors. So I shouldn't say they are struggling or sinking. That's how they fall into the index. Whereas men are more likely to be what we call in the index thriving or existing. Worse over, though, is this index we just ran quarterly, and we have the Q1 results right now, and it's only gotten worse for women since late last year.
Much worse. I hate to say, but much worse. The next one is a very interesting one. You alluded to how intersectionality of gender plays a role. Do you have any trend or stories to share from your research experience?
Yeah, well, we've spoken about so many issues here today, and I think that's really important. We know that more women are facing mental health challenges. As we said, the proportion is also much higher among Canadians under 35, higher among BIPOC individuals, and those with children under 18 in the house, so higher among parents. This points towards the importance of considering that intersectionality and the disproportionate impact on women of color, younger women, on mothers. Gender intersects with everything. We cannot think of visible minorities without thinking of gender. We cannot have diversity and inclusion initiatives without keeping these intersections in mind.
The next question is about our global study. So it reads, which other countries are included in the global study, and can we access the report?
Oh, that's a great question. Let me just pull up the notes here. So I said we surveyed in 28 countries. I think you presented some of that data as well. So Canada and 27 other countries. And we do this surveying via our Global Advisor Service. So the 28 countries are the United States, Israel, Turkey, South Africa, Australia, Brazil, mainland China, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, Spain, Great Britain, Argentina, Belgium, Hungary, India, Israel, Mexico, Poland, Russia, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, South Korea, Sweden, and Turkey. And what was the second part of the question?
Can we access the report?
Yes, actually, the international study was publicly released for International Women's Day, so it can be found on our website.
And we run this every year. This year, the focus was COVID, and every year it's topical, and all of that is publicly released and can be found on our website.
Yeah.
Next question is specifically for you, Jen, and you will know why. How does Ipsos perform when it comes to gender equity?
Oh, another good question.
The Gender Balance Network.
I am on the Gender Balance Network, yeah. So we, Ipsos celebrated International Women's Day earlier this week. I learned in our celebrations that in 2021, 60% of all of our employees around the world are women, and that in 2018, we were the first major company listed on the Paris Stock Exchange with a board of directors respecting gender parity. But of course, we're not perfect. So that Gender Balance Network, we know we're not perfect. We recognize this. We've got a lot of work to do. So we have this network. It's very active among male and female employees to work towards the goal of achieving better gender equity in the company. Very proud to be part of that.
Yes, and we recently rebranded this initiative. It was actually called Women in Ipsos.
That's right.
We learned that language and the terms that we use are really important, and it's not just about women in Ipsos, it's about inclusion. So it has to be called Gender Balance Network.
Absolutely.
And looking at the time, I think we have time for some more questions. From your personal experience, managing and balancing professional and personal life, do you have any tips you can share?
That's a good one. I guess my number one tip, if I had to think about it, This didn't happen last night, but ordinarily I would say sleep. I didn't sleep well last night. We had a lot of nightmares in the house with the kids. But I've noticed over the course of the pandemic that I've become increasingly tired. Instead of fighting it and trying to do it all like I used to do in the wee hours of the night, I'm now forcing myself to go to bed earlier. Some things aren't getting done, but my mind is much clearer. So that's how I'm juggling it all. What about you? How do you do it all?
Me?
Yeah.
I would say take it easy. Like somehow over the course of 1 year, everyone has this sudden need to upskill, and people are becoming chefs, hairdressers, yoga instructors, and all I find myself wanting to do is let the steam off. Pamper myself or binge watch a show. So I realized that all my spare time does not have to be spent on activities that are considered productive. So it's okay to just read a children's fantasy book and let your mind relax. It's just take it easy is my
Good for you.
Progress, but I try.
I love it. That's great advice.
All right. I think that was our last question. Unless we have any more questions, we can move ahead. And before we leave you, we want to, ask you to watch out for this upcoming point of view by our two very brilliant colleagues, Naomi Huck and Mark Modesky. They're going to be leaning in to the findings from our social listening platforms, as well as our Ipsos Essentials, which is the biweekly tracker looking at impacts of the pandemic and consumer response. They're going to be coming up with a point of view later this month, so watch out. And with that, I'll pass it over to our moderator. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Wow, I just really want to thank Jennifer and Siam for today's really interesting presentation. I don't get an advanced copy of these presentations, so I followed along very, very closely and found the data and the insights really interesting. I want to say that there were some more questions that were coming in that Siam didn't see. And so all those questions as well, thank you, will be replied to by email directly. As well, you'll receive an email probably Monday with a link to today's recorded presentation. Remember, there is a handout in the webinar console that I ask that you download and refer to. And of course, please reach out to Siam and Jennifer directly if you have any more questions. That now concludes today's webinar. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you.